just thinking about the world of sport, and it is so easy to list many, many problems that exist. Now, from a leadership perspective, it is your responsibility to be able to think about and solve a multitude of problems. And Chapter 6 tackles that area, and today we're going to take a look at solving these problems, as well as 3 models to work through in order to use them. Now, really, if only it were this easy, and solving problems really always isn't this easy. Some actually take years to tackle. Well, there are some that only take a few minutes. But what's important to understand is that as the leader, you are responsible for many of the decisions. When I was the athletic director, there would literally be a line outside my door of staff or students who needed help with a problem. Now, some of these problems were easy and I could work through them quickly, and some were more complex and needed some thought, or I'd need to work with my administrative team to help solve them. But there are some really big problems, and those are the type that we're talking about today. And there are problems that involve many people, and they involve working with people above and below you in the organization chart. And with these types of problems, the answer isn't always clear, and the results can be very messy. And the way that we look at solving problems today is quite different than we did even a decade ago. Now, when we look at problem solving from the past, it was very much hierarchical. It was what the boss said, and it was, dispersed down through the system, and people did whatever they were supposed to do, or what they were told to do. Now, in the 1990s, Peter Senge came along with what he called the 5th discipline, and really where he talked about leadership from a responsibility for learning and being able to articulate what that leadership role meant, how you were going to have people understand it. That's through clarifying the vision, and then using what he used as these mental modes in order to increase the responsibility and the understanding of his staff, so that they were able to solve problems that were good for the organization. And McCrimmon really understood that we operate in a knowledge-driven age, in looking at from an internet and how we process information, and how ever-changing it is. And being able to be innovative is exactly crucial. So what all of this means is that now, from a leadership perspective, we really need to be able to have special skills and to be able to think strategically about how you solve problems, and being able to use multiple levels of experience. And when you look at this cartoon, this guy seems to have some sort of a competencies that this business is looking for. And that is really what happens within our leadership structures. So you really do need to build competencies. These are the ones that Mumford and the co-authors really took a look at, and understand that in order to be able to solve big complex problems from a leadership perspective, we do need to be able to think creatively about how you solve the problem. That's that first box. And then from a second box, how do these social cues and judgments come into play? Working with others, what is the harm that could be, that could happen? What are the behaviors that play into that? And then looking at that third box, it all comes into being that that there's some knowledge that needs to be understood, some sort of expertise, some ability to understand the organization and the people, and then take those that knowledge and be able to help solve a problem. Now, these problems are also very complex, and they really come from a lot of different sources. And we need to be able to think about how a problem becomes relative to each of these areas. From an economic standpoint, how will this impact the bottom line? What will be some financial repercussions? could we be sued? Are there lawsuits and some other legal responsibilities that we would be responsible for? Public relations issues. Is there some way that we could get beat up in the media about it? How does this fit into the political structure and the politics that are out there? Are there people we need to align with? Are there coalitions we want to stay with or keep away from? Those all play into it. What are the socio-cultural issues involved in this complex problem that you're trying to solve? Looking at and addressing areas and issues of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. Those all play in. And certainly, understanding the technology issues that exist, and they can be very complex. If you even thinking about, the NFL and the replay issues, and how that problem is being solved, and as we move forward. But all of these issues need to be thought about when we're looking at issues. Now, the book displays three approaches to solving complex problems. And there are many, but the book chooses these three, and I like them. They're good, and they bring in different areas that you can think about and different approaches that you can use. The first is the Cyanophin framework. And it looks crazy, I know it does. But if you take a moment and you read through it, it's actually, this slide right here, it can be very helpful to solving a problem. The problem, that's the disorder that occurs, that's in the center. And then you decide if something is simple. If it's a simple problem, like in the lower right-hand quadrant, it just becomes a cause and effect. What is the issue? How do you solve it? You've got a customer, a fan who's unhappy because of some ticket issue. How do you solve that problem? And it becomes pretty easy. Then there are problems that are complicated. There might be a little bit more than one right answer. Thinking about the NCAA and all the conference realignment that we've gone through, budget cuts, and that programs might have to deal with, and then thinking about how that impacts Title IX. Those are just some examples of a complicated problem. Then you move into more of a complex. And complex problems are multifaceted and very often unpredictable. And there could be unintended consequences that could affect others. Again, thinking about budget cuts, and not only budget cuts within an athletic department, but then how do those budget cuts resolve and resonate throughout the organization? Increasing costs and trying to be able to figure out how that goes. And then the final sense of problem is one that involves chaos. This is really something that is very severe, a very turbulent, a crisis that happens. It typically requires something immediate and decisive. So, for example, you've got a natural disaster that occurred, during a sporting event, or you've got a fan or a riot, maybe a terrorist activity that happened, at a stadium. Those are, fatalities maybe that involve team members on a travel. These are not, chaos is not good problems to have to solve, but they're really when you think about that crisis. Now, if we take a look at Bolman and Deal's 4 frames, kind of a boring slide compared to the one we just looked at. But what Bolman and Deal say is that we have a predisposition towards solving a problem, and that's fine. But we can't forget that even maybe we approach all our problems from a structural standpoint, we can't forget that there's these other, the human resource, the politics, the symbols that play in. And by thinking about all 4 of those, we then solve a problem much stronger. So for example, let's say that there was a hazing incident that occurred on the volleyball team. If you approach it from a structural standpoint as a leader, you would look here from a structural standpoint of outlining policies. What are the rules? You would have swift punishment, and those decisions would be made, and you would move on. Now, we also would need to make sure that we're looking at it from a human resource perspective. And now, from a human resource, from an HR perspective, you would demonstrate concern and support for the victims, but also support for for the perpetrators. Do they need counseling? How do what are the lessons that can be learned, and how do you reconnect the team, or reconnect other teams within the athletic department? Again, if you're thinking of a specific hazing incident. You would also need to be able to think about what are the politics that might exist. For example, is there a power differential that exists between the upper and the lower class, on this team? And if so, if you're the coach, how do you leverage that? How do you get in and deal with these political issues, so that you can eliminate any future hazing or other destructive team behaviors? And then finally, from a symbolic standpoint, hazing is often seen as initiation. It's about being fully accepted. That is important, and especially from a team. But you don't want to do it when you're thinking about the dangers of hazing. So, from a symbolic standpoint, you still want to have people feel accepted. So maybe you would create new activities, come up with new ceremonies. So that's why it's important that you would tackle, again, from just that example of hazing, being able to play through each of these different areas from a Bowman and Deal's way of looking at it. Now, this is the normative decision model. I know, it looks a little crazy. But what you do is you have a problem that you're trying to solve. And what you do is you just answer yes or no as you go through the problem. And when you reach an ending, so for example, if you decide that the quality of the decision isn't important, and that the team commitment isn't important to the decision, you would then end up with an A1 response. And an A1, it means that it is an autocratic. It says you have the information as a leader that you need, you make the decision, and you move on. You don't have to involve anybody else. And so when you think about, how a problem may play through, it can get quite complex. But if you take that problem and you work it through each of these different channels, it will help you then decide, where you land on that normative decision model. And it can be helpful because it asks you questions that you might not be thinking about, and being able then to bring in more information and how that all fits. So today we looked at, how do you solve problems, complex problems, and being able to understand how that works and the importance of that. And we specifically looked at three approaches that the book talked about, and being able to think about how you can use those actually to help solve problems. And that's what you're going to do, because your assignment having to do with Chapter 6 is solving a problem. And you will be using one of these frameworks, whichever one you choose, in order to answer those questions. So I wish you the best of luck.